And now let me turn this over to our moderator, Quentin Hardy. Quentin is national editor of Forbes magazine. He has been a journalist for about 28 years, having started out at the Wall Street Journal in 1987. He will tell, not 28, sorry about that.
I'm going to be processing that right there.
Let's don't. He will tell you that it is the best ever career, that he gets paid to find out about the world and then tell people what he finds. But before journalism took Quentin around the world, he trotted the globe for yet a different purpose. Believe it or not, he was a traveling salesman selling textbooks. And that wasn't his first sales gig. He once sold handcrafted puppets on the street in New York City at Fifth Avenue in Soho. And this gave him great sympathy with people who actually have to hustle for a buck.
My basis as a business journalist is in the real. Like, people go out and ask for the check have a lot of respect from me. Yeah.
So, Quentin, it's great to have you back on our stage. Everyone, please welcome respected journalist Quentin Hardy.
Well, if I could figure out a way for 24 years not to pass, I would have taken that career, but it's been pretty good as it is. Now, we're here to talk about innovation tonight, and I want to just say a few words, frame that if I can, so we can have the most effective possible discussion. In both the long view and the short view, we are a people with a healthy obsession for innovation. I'll take the long view and drill down. If you look at us as a kind of a civilization, plenty of civilizations invent new things, but kind of uniquely, we focus on using innovation in the interests of renewal and improvement in our world, in changing radically or incrementally our systems, our markets, and our use of resources. We see ourselves reinventing ourselves again and again. It's interesting, innovation is a word that came out of the Renaissance period, and before that really hadn't been conceived of in quite that way. Now, as such, innovation is fundamentally about values. How do we change and improve our products, our processes, and ultimately ourselves to best accommodate the changing conditions we are creating in the world? It's a critical force for sustained improvement in our material conditions, and by definition, innovation is the only way we can solve the world's most pressing problems around energy, the environment, poverty, conflict. One thing for sure, if you've got a problem, you only compound it by keeping on the same practices as before. This suggests that innovation is particularly a challenge to large organizations because they have the resources to tackle the big issues. But innovation also has to start small, and at that scale, it's hard for big innovations to master them. It's a challenge to big organizations in that sense, too. How can a big organization with a lot of established practices and expectations internally and from the world take on the new and change itself in a healthy way? I hope our guests can help us with that tonight. Here in the Valley, of course, innovation is a particularly treasured practice. The 8 malcontents who got unhappy at Shockley Semiconductor went out to create Fairchild Semiconductor, which begat Intel and some 60 other companies just by those 8 people. And also the industry of venture capital, seeding more invention and innovation by funding new companies and also enabling them to join or create new ecosystems of economics and technology. But we seem to worry today a lot that we aren't innovating the way we used to. And, you find a lot of reasons for this. Maybe we're too fat and happy. Maybe we've become change averse. We don't embrace risk the way we used to. Maybe we're over-regulated. Maybe there's more competition, so it's harder. I actually wonder if the problem is that we're innovating at about the same rate, which was pretty good. There's just too many inventions to take on at this point. We feel somewhat overwhelmed by the number of changes, which is to say that we still have to adapt, but it's hard to stitch all that in, and we have to, at the risk of being somewhat redundant, innovate around the idea of innovation itself and think about how we can make this a healthy, conscious part of many, many aspects of our lives. I was speaking with a smart CEO in the Valley one day, and he said, companies don't go out of business or fail because they run out of money. Obviously they do, but that's sort of like saying a plane crashes because it hits the ground. There isn't a lot of information in that. Companies actually fail because they run out of ideas. They keep doing the same thing, and they're not reevaluating their processes. And his point really was 360 degrees they're not reevaluating their processes because we're getting information from so many sources. Nowadays, you have to not just think about product design and creation, you have to think about innovation or change or adaptation in terms of HR or food services, you name it, how parking is done. Everything needs to be doing it. And that's a very difficult thing to sort of stitch in as a cultural aspect. But lucky for us, we have with us tonight Mark Johnson. You've been introduced, but I'll make the introductions again. Co-founder and chairman of Innosight. Kaaren Hanson, vice president of design innovation at Intuit. Inder Sidhu, senior vice president for strategy and planning worldwide operations at Cisco. And my buddy Lewin, corporate vice president at Microsoft for strategy and
emerging business development.
Emerging businesses. So innovation on all sides. I want to just start working down the line, and then we'll drill in a little deeper with a kind of top line question. Mark, starting with you, do you think innovation has broken down? And if so, what needs to be done on a large conceptual level?
Well, I don't actually, I haven't framed the issue that innovation is broken down. I think the way I've seen it is that innovation has taken on a new imperative, which is when you see a lot of companies and managers going to events and asking, how can we be more innovative? They're actually asking a new question. They're saying, how do we innovate to create new growth? That the innovation that we've been experiencing to help sustain our core business has not, it's lost its luster. It's not delivering the returns. It's not satisfying the customers we thought that it would. And so therefore, our ability to stay on top of the game and move forward has not been fulfilled by the innovation that we had once experienced before. And
what do you think's going on there?
I think it's in the classic sense of disruptive innovation, that the innovations that are being provided to existing customers have not been really thought through to understand that they're overshooting a lot of what people in the core markets need. Mm-hmm. And that the real opportunity is to either reinvent what you're providing to customers and not just give them the next iteration of a product or service, give them a new attribute, like making something more convenient or lower cost to create growth within core markets, or to go outside of the mainstream into adjacent markets, into whole new markets such as the emerging markets.
So are you saying they need to understand their customers better? They don't understand their customers as well as they used to?
Absolutely. And I'm sure Kaaren would agree with that.
Starting to lean forward.
Yeah, there you go. We got the lean forward. Go straight to you. What do you got?
Well, I was just going to say that often when companies are started, it's because the founder has a problem or has a friend who has a very significant problem that they want to solve well. And so they have a lot of passion towards that because they're very connected to the customer. And at Intuit, what we found is a couple years ago, we started to really reignite the innovation that was happening by getting our very small teams very close to the customer again. So we broke it down from having large teams of 25, 50, 75, down to teams of 4 or 5 people. And we had them rapidly iterating with their customers, often on a weekly basis, which brought back that passion that was inside of them. And it also brought them very, very close to understanding that customer and their pain so they could think of new ways of potentially solving those problems.
You'll need to back up a little bit on that. You have broken down into teams of 4 or 5 people. Mm-hmm. How could they each have a different customer given that Intuit has a relatively finite universe of products?
They may be solving different aspects of that customer problem. So part of it is, it's not that every time we go out to innovate in a particular area we're going to succeed. We know that. We know that there are going to be a lot of failures. But the best way to get more wins is to have more what you call at-bats, right? To have more teams out there and experimenting. Now, I will say that we do have larger teams on things like the TurboTax code base, right? It turns out that taking the U.S. tax code and putting it into the back-end system.
The 4 guys who do that.
Right, exactly. That's more than 4 guys, especially with QA. But on top of that, we have small teams like SnapTax, which is the offering where you can take your iPhone, you snap a photo of your W-2, you answer a handful of questions, and then in 15 minutes or less, you filed your taxes, assuming you have a fairly simple tax situation. That was a team of 5 people that leveraged the TurboTax back-end engines, but they were out there innovating with their customers.
So to circle back to my top question, has innovation broken down generally in corporate America, or did it?
I think what happens is the older companies get, the further they and their employees get from the customers, from the problems that they're truly trying to solve. And I think the further you get from those customers, the more innovation breaks down. So I think it depends upon where that company is in its cycle.
We'll get into the problem of upstream communications to change the company in a minute, because that's just half the puzzle. Inder, what would you say?
You know, what I'd like to do is, I think before we really talk about innovation broadly, I'd like to differentiate between two different kinds of innovation, because I think it's germane to the question you asked, Quentin.
Sure.
And that is the notion of sustaining innovation and disruptive innovation. You know, sustaining innovation is the faster, cheaper, nicer, better, sleeker version of everything every year. I have an iPhone 3GS, my wife has iPhone 4. That's sustaining innovation, better, faster, cheaper, sleeker, nicer. On the other hand, what Apple did with the App Store, what they did with the iTunes Store, what they even did with the retail store in this industry is disruptive innovation, where fundamentally where money gets made in the industry gets changed around. And those are two very different kinds of innovation. So to answer your question about whether innovation is dead or alive, what I would say is that if you are a small startup company, you do disruptive innovation rather well. That's what you're programmed to do. But you couldn't do sustaining innovation if your life depended on it, because you haven't built the install base and you haven't developed that skill set. On the other hand, if you're a large company like ours or yours or many of the ones represented in this room, it's very hard to do disruptive innovation, because everything in your DNA is programmed to actually not do that. I mean, I can tell you at Cisco, our investors and our shareholders and even our executives sometimes don't really want to do disruptive innovation because we're addicted to the profitability that our business has created, even though sometime in the future that might cause a problem for us. Our employees don't always want to do disruptive innovation because they want to operate in their comfort zone. Our customers don't want us to do disruptive innovation because they want us to build the faster, cheaper, better router, very similar to the one that they're used to. So I think it's hard for companies that are large to do disruptive innovation, and that, I think, is one of the core things that we have to really figure out. And the second point I'd make, Quentin, is that if you can figure out a way to do disruptive innovation and sustaining innovation both, and if you can get a multiplier effect between the two, then you can get some extraordinary returns, and that's something that we've experienced certainly in our business, is that when you get those two engines working, kind of in a flywheel effect where each reinforces the other, great things happen. Because it's not that disruptive innovation is necessarily, it might be more sexy, but it doesn't mean sustaining innovation is not required. You need both, and if you can get that multiplier between the two, great things happen.
Well, what's wrong with being addicted to the profitability of existing products? They're profitable.
There's nothing wrong with it being addicted to the profitability of existing products, but if it takes you down in a particular direction where you're continuously moving farther and farther away from getting disrupted at the low end, that could be a problem. You could get isolated.
It might blind you to the changes in the world around.
It blinds you to the changes, and you might paint yourself into a corner. You know, some of the work, for example, Mark, that you've done along with Clayton Christensen has really pointed out how if you basically get so addicted to profitability, you kind of protect your near term at the expense of your long term. So you'll make a lot of money in the near term, and then you're going to really get disrupted by somebody from the bottom in the long term. And that is the main reason why most companies get disrupted. That's the reason why you got entrepreneurs in the room.
Daniel, this is never a charge I've heard leveled at Microsoft, of course.
Which
the idea
charge?
of being addicted to certain profitable products.
They're
At
good
the
to
expense
have.
of seeing the larger context
They're
of the
very
world.
good to have. They're very good to have.
Especially in large quantities.
Sorry, man.
Yeah. I think the frame of reference that people brought to the table is interesting, and maybe I'll comment relative to the way that we approach sort of that spectrum. I mean, clearly there's the core innovation around, if you will, sustainable and existing product lines, and the promise that you keep with your existing customer base, and in our case with Windows clearly at the core, that's a long-term compatibility commitment that we make. Very different to juxtapose. You brought up Apple, where about every 3 years it's good that you have a new machine because the old stuff doesn't run anymore. So again, there are benefits on both sides.
I got that. That was a
right. That's okay. I grew up at Apple. It's a good place to be. Spent my formative years there. But my point is, it's just different approaches.
Sure.
And so the model of sustaining compatibility and a promise that you make it puts you into that dilemma, as people have so well written about. But at the same time, inside of Microsoft, there's a plethora of new approaches to doing both disruptive and fundamental new invention. And we approach it in various ways. Most people know we have a lot of software engineers, on the order of 40,000 or so. But at the same time, there are 850 people in Microsoft Research, of which all have PhDs, of which all are furthering the state of the art in their discipline, of which all do exactly what they want to do, not what we tell them to do, but they're hired in the domain of areas that we find interesting and believe are important to our future.
Yeah.
Right? So within that frame of reference, there's this very long-term view of fundamental invention and idea creation, and then the process, and we've got multiples, which we could talk about if people are interested in, of how you pull that into existing core product lines. Things like we've done to improve reliability of Windows over time with this core update capability, which came out of search, or what was done most recently with Connect, where all the sensor and vision technology, some was developed, some came out of research, and some came from an acquisition.
Well, of course, R&D is formal change. R&D is saying, disrupt us, and we have a process to stitch it in.
Right.
That has limitations as well.
True.
I was going to ask you, Daniel, so related to that, 10, 15 years into Microsoft Research, would you call that a success or a failure?
Oh, absolutely a success in various ways, not the least of which is the impact on the product areas where things have been integrated into both existing product lines and disruptive new things that are new businesses, but also into what we would consider sort of the virtuous cycle of the intellectual property framework upon which our whole industry has been built, which is this regime of research in the universities being done, sponsored by governments and others over time, and then that process of turning the crank and contributing back to the university community for sponsored research and things like that, which we do unabashedly, and we don't control the IP.
But I think R&D is, a formal means to disruption.
Right.
And as such, has a place, particularly in the financial and organizational model of the company.
Sure.
And that tames it in a sense. And I'll tell a story, not as a knock to Microsoft, but it's illustrative, and I could point to every company, including my own, in a similar way. In 2002, I did a cover story on Google, and I called up a large company in Seattle about this search thing, and they really couldn't get back to me about search and how it was important. And eventually, after 2 months of asking, and I was like, this is a really big deal. You guys should look, the search things. They got somebody from research on to talk about desktop search. And that was how they were conceiving of search. And I was like, you really, this isn't where I'm going with this. It's web, and advertising-based web search. And the issue was they conceived of the world around the desktop. Sure. Forbes has had a similar problem. Sure. And that's, conceiving the world as being continuous with your earlier process.
Oh, sure.
Everybody does. So how do you get that kind of awareness of change stitched into a company?
Well, it's pretty fundamental. The question, which business you have to pick the businesses you want to be in.
Particularly
since
the street doesn't reward you for
company,
it.
The number one challenge is to decide which businesses you're going to be in.
Yeah,
That's basically what they can do. And if the choices are not there to be in that business, then you miss it and or decide to enter later.
Well, there are leadership challenges beyond that. You have to figure out ways to stitch it in correctly through other leadership. But Inder.
Can I speak to that? Because I think that there's some very instructive and very useful lessons from Microsoft, because I think they've done a lot of things right. But at Cisco, we were actually faced with a similar challenge, which is we've got a ton of mainstream businesses that are very, very profitable. Sure. And when you try to start something new, all the antibodies come out and they try to smother it with so much love that they crush it and they kill it, right? So what we had to do is we had to actually literally go to the bunker and create a separate unit for internal incubation called our Emerging Technologies Group. And what we did is we took a guy who, South African guy, Martin de Beer, who had the heart of a company loyalist but the soul of an entrepreneur. And we basically said, Martin, leave behind your 1,500 people, just come with your admin assistant and start this new area. And he said, if you want to fire me, you could just tell me that right now. I'll just go home. And we said, no, this is actually a real opportunity, Martin. We really think you ought to do that. And so he said, okay, I'll take the job provided there's one condition, and the condition is I'm allowed to fail. And we said, okay, that's fine, so long as you fail only once for the same reason.
The same reason.
And,
For
right?
the same reason.
So
right,
don't
exactly.
fail for the same reason twice. And so
right.
he took the job, and one of the first things he did was he built this product called Telepresence, which was very, very innovative. But one of the things, to your earlier point, Daniel, in that business unit, while they were creating a lot of new things, before they were allowed to build even their first product, they had to go and interview 30 different customers and really find out what the needs of those customers were to make sure that they were uniquely meeting those needs, as opposed to just incrementally extending a product. We took Martin and reported him straight to the CEO of the company. We gave him a budget that was protected during good times and bad. We told him that he could hire anyone from inside the company or outside the company. And by the way, when he hired someone from inside the company, he could give them any incentive structure that he wanted, including a reward. I mean, I'll give you one example. This is a little crazy, but and my numbers might be slightly off, but when they were building the Telepresence product, he told his team, if you build that product on schedule in whatever it is, 2 years or 18 months, you get to keep your job. You build it in 3 months less, I'll write every one of your $25,000 check. You build it in 6 months less, we'll make it a $50,000 check. And if you build it in 9 months less, it'll be a $100,000 check, etc. That's about the time when the human resources lady had a heart attack. But the point of it is basically, he had the ability to have a sheltered environment, but to violate all the rules, go inside and outside the company, to then create a product that did get done. I remember driving to their building on a Saturday night. The parking lot's full of cars, there's pizza and beer, they're having a good time, and the product gets done ahead of schedule, and it's fundamentally disruptive compared to what we were doing. So I think if you get the incentives right, and you stay close to your customer, and you let the systems kind of take care of themselves without getting overly intrusive into them, you could actually come up with some pretty good disruptive innovation, even within the context of a larger company.
How visible was he to the rest of the organization and to Wall Street while this was going on?
He was fairly visible to the rest of the organization because they all were jealous and envious of the fact that his budget was protected and he was getting a lot of air cover from the CEO. But he was not really that visible to Wall Street because we basically said, your job is to come up with interesting, innovative, new ideas.
I think that in some ways this is the leadership challenge. Change on both fronts is really not rewarded up front. People say we love change, they don't, and the street really doesn't love change.
Right.
Both your companies are doing very innovative things. The street is not rewarding them. And it takes a very, very strong, clear leader at the top to stay that course and not do the things that people like for the next quarter. But Mark, you want to take
I want to
talk about leadership a little bit.
Well, it'd be leadership and taking innovation definition to the next level, because I think it's relevant to figuring out what's really happening with the challenges in incumbent organizations. So in my parlance, disruptive innovation is relative to the market. So a disruptive innovation is an innovation that, compared to existing offerings, provides something that is cheaper, simpler, easier to use. It offers up new attributes of performance of which the market can value. Whether or not the corporation that's providing the innovation actually has to disrupt itself to deliver. So, classic example I describe in the book, and have a gentleman here from, at least formerly from Procter & Gamble, is Swiffer. When the Swiffer was introduced as a consumable in the mop category, it was hugely disruptive to mop manufacturers because it completely changed the game. But it was very sustaining to Procter & Gamble. It was very enhancing because it leveraged existing consumables branded business model. But it was a game changer, and it completely changed the industry and what it provided as an innovation. It was still challenging for Procter & Gamble, not so much because it was changing the culture of the organization or it was something that was disruptive to existing products and services. The challenge had to do with the knowledge to assumption ratio, that there were a high number of assumptions compared to existing knowledge, that were going into a new category they'd never been before. They were innovating not only a product, but almost like a system. So there was lack of clarity about whether there was going to be a great new opportunity or not. And it was the the need to learn and build assumptions that took time, that flew in the face of other innovations in the core markets where they wanted to get them out fairly quickly for the sake of
Talk
profit.
for a minute about the internal cell, because you're asking people to change in some way. But they have to envision that from where they are now and see a kind of continuity in that.
But what I want to say is they're not really changing from the way I look at it. So do you want me to give you real change? It's back to business model innovation. When you have to change the way you fundamentally operate, when you have to change the way you turn a profit. So like when Digital Equipment, Prime, Wang, and Nixdorf, many computer manufacturers disrupted by the personal computer, the reason that they were literally disrupted is because the digital equipments of the world at the time in the late 70s were making 60% gross margins on $500,000 machines. The personal computer comes in and says, you got to make money such that you're only selling now $4,000 or less machines on 40% gross margins going to 20% gross margins. It's when you have to change the profit formula in the way you operate that's truly disruptive. So I just want to make that distinction is there's two challenges. One is when you go into a new market and create a whole new opportunity in adjacent space where you have to learn what the customer's trying to do, your knowledge to assumption ratio is low and you need to discover and develop. But you're not fundamentally changing the organization. You're just in a mode of learning and discovery, but you could ultimately leverage the existing business model. If you go further away to where you're changing the whole operating paradigm and how you create a profit, that's truly disruptive to an organization, and that's where you do really need to separate out and be ready to create a whole new business model because the whole nature of making money
What's the
operating.
successful sell around a whole new business model? We're going to survive, or we'll achieve scale that will lead to more profitability. How do you work something like that?
I think that the market is changing, that if we don't change with it, we are going to be disrupted,
we will
right?
not survive.
And we never worry about being disrupted by the big companies. We worry about being disrupted by the little guys, right? And the way that we think about it, we don't actually have a separate business unit that we fund to do the innovation. Instead, we talk a lot about horizon planning, and we use a slightly different definition than that in HBR. But effectively, we talk about our H1s, which are our core businesses that provide the bulk of our revenue and the bulk of our profitability. We have H2s that are rapidly growing, that really provide the revenue growth that we're looking for. And then we have our H3s, which are ideas that have a lot of potential. They're not making any money yet. We don't expect them to make any money yet, right? We're looking at very different metrics around those. We're looking around metrics around, basically love metrics, right? Like, do our customers really love it or not? And we expect every single one of our GMs to have a portfolio approach across these Horizon 1, Horizon 2, and Horizon 3 offerings.
What do you find effective? Large messages from the top, incremental patterns of behavior. How do you instantiate this so that it's successful?
The way we do it is through the questions we ask and through the operating reviews. It's always great. What % of your resources are in your H1, H2, and H3? What are the metrics for the H1s, the H2s, and the H3s?
So it's really clear. People know where
Very
to point.
clear.
Okay.
I think also, Quentin, just to add to that, I think if you're going to fundamentally cause people to go on a different trajectory from the one that they're on, they either need to be inspired or they need to be scared. You can inspire them with a lot of vision, or you can
Is that
paint
fear and greed?
or you could paint the picture of a burning platform and say we're going to all go down. And
Okay, it's greed and fear.
yeah, greed and fear. I mean, those are it because fundamentally, when you net it all,
There aren't a
the way
lot of
down-
things in this world. Yeah.
Yeah,
There you go.
I think vision works better.
Vision works better if, but there are instances where it might be too late to inspire people with vision, right? I think most of you might have read the recent memo from Stephen Elop to the rest of Nokia describing how they are in a burning platform kind of a situation where there's a battle of ecosystems going on and they're fighting a war of devices, right? It's a whole different game. So he had to paint that vision and take some actions as a result of that. So I think that was more burning platform as opposed to
If Chambers did that inside Cisco, how would that go over?
I think Cisco is one of those companies that generally does well on the positive side in terms of being inspired by vision.
Yeah.
And I think that's because companies over time develop a certain kind of DNA. And but I think that there have been instances in our history during the dot-com bust, for instance, where things got pretty ugly and we had to actually take some drastic measures, including laying off 15% of the workforce, et cetera. So But I think you actually snap back out of it, back to, most people either get inspired by one or the other, right? And you go back to what is your native mode of operation. And for Cisco, that's to be led by inspired leaders.
Now, Daniel, if I were to, from the outside, a couple of big innovations I can see at Microsoft involve NUI, gesture stuff that you're doing now, or XML leading to cloud stuff.
Right.
Are those formally articulated? Do they kind of grow up inside the organization? How do you introduce those kind of ideas?
Those are very valid touch points, and both go back quite some time. XML goes back to 1997. Before I got to the company, there was a small group of people paying really close attention to what was going on with startups, for the most part. And at the end of the day, the IT industry, as we know and love it, and most of us here are representative of it, was about, I would say, small I and large T. A lot about the technology and a little bit about the information. And come Y2K, massive sell-in is probably the last chance that the industry had to really sell a lot of technology to customers as an enabling process to bypass that silly clock thing. Mm-hmm. And then at that point, it became a lot more about information. So the good news for Microsoft was in the late 90s, 97, in fact, a lot of energy was put on XML, the standards bodies, with the expectation that at some moment in time, interoperability, commitment to internet-based standards, XML being the primary to describe the data, and then all the transport and protocol requirements to move information freely and securely over the internet over time, was going to happen. And because the company was both in content-less applications, which was what I would say office automation is all about, automating rational tasks. And there were big industries present that could be disassembled and reassembled into new business models, whether it was the likes of Wang or others that were building these machines that were very expensive and just re-engineering it around a new model. The belief was, the data was going to get set free, content rich, and so that's this whole XML.net initiative and revolution. So people really were planning for that a long time before it became clear in the market that it was important and needed to be re-engineered.
It has enabled you to have...
Yeah, it's a strong basis to enter the enterprise market. Most people, we have this sleepy server and tools business inside of Microsoft that in 15 years is a $15 billion business.
Yeah.
And it's all around servers and tools that build this infrastructure stuff. So the NUI stuff goes way, way back to a lot of the research work and gesture work. So a lot of the touch stuff is pretty fundamental. The Surface technology, which we introduced some time ago, was sort of some of the first touch. We just did CES in January.
Their first real hit, though, is the Kinect.
Yeah, in terms of our implementation or application of that invention.
Does that go?
Yeah, that stuff goes way, way back. I do the math, 10 years plus in terms of research and gestures and figuring all those things out. So I'd have to look to give you a specific example, but it's way, way back into research. So the challenge is, as we've been pointing out in these conversations, is how do you, within the context of a large organization, with all of the pressures in any fast-growing business that's growing double digits, producing incredible margins and return to the shareholders, how do you balance those investments and then consider the distribution of new resource to create new businesses?
No.
So we've gotten a lot better at it, but like any large company, it is a portfolio bet, as people have been talking about.
Well, unless T. Ballmer has supernatural powers, there were probably several other bets he made that didn't pan out over the last 15 years.
Oh, sure.
If the failure rate on innovation is 50% or 90%, or I saw one study, 99.7397%.
Something like that, yeah.
It's a ridiculous number of failures on the way.
Sure.
So is it a toleration for failure? Is it an ability to see?
Well, some of it is timing, and some of it is execution. Some of it is business model. Some of it is the timeliness of the market. Acceptance and willingness.
The challenge to management is sort of knowing how to size things correctly.
Exactly.
How do you time this one? How do you stitch it in?
That's exactly right.
And how do they get the correct information upstream to do that?
Well, I think, just to key on the word timing, and that goes back to your question about leadership. I think the number one issue, in my view, is about leadership in the sense of managing this timing issue, because that's how you'll manage the risk. So it's this paradox that a leader faces when it comes to creating innovation for new growth. on the one hand, leaders are asked to allocate resources towards things that will sustain the growth, and they have the pressures of Wall Street and quarterly earnings. So if you're a $50 billion company, and you want to grow 10%, you're looking for $5 billion. So innovation projects where the proposal comes in and says, the first couple of years we're only going to make $1 million, do nothing for that, that need to satisfy the growth objective. So there's an impetus in the organization to say, we're going to give you a lot of resources and infrastructure because an expectation is created to grow that fairly rapidly. But by creating the innovation structure that way, you're taking incredible risk. So a lot of times these things don't get funded or what have you. If you go the flip side and you say, well, we're going to process this as this slow, manage this over time so that we can learn and test our assumptions, you won't meet the quarterly growth expectations, but you will manage the risk because you'll be patient for growth, you'll start small, and you'll be able to test and learn. And what a leader needs to do, and I'll say this quickly and then I'm done, is back to doing both, is that he or she has to be able to say there is going to be a set of things that are not going to hit for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years out. But they will be our opportunity for the future to see around corners. And so if you manage the process the right way, then we can be more successful at innovation.
Right. Kaaren, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we actually try not to rely on our managers to decide if the time is right for something to go forward or not. We try to rely on the market and the data from our customers. So, for example, in India, we went after a space where we found that farmers were having difficulty, paying their bills, and many of them were actually committing suicide, right? So a small team, again, 4 or 5 people, went out to study the farmers and to understand what was going on. And it turns out, if you narrow the target to farmers of perishable goods, such as tomatoes, when you look at them in rural India, they often are able to go to one market or to another, right? They can't go to both in one day, so they'll typically choose one to go to. Once they get to that market, they work with a Mandi agent to get the price for their tomatoes. All of this is done with almost no transparency. There literally is a cloth over the Mandi agent's hand as he's figuring out the price to give that farmer. So the farmer gets the best price they can, but of course they've got these tomatoes that are going to go bad because they don't have refrigeration, right? And they can't go to a different market. So we looked at this and we thought, well, there's a big opportunity here. Could we solve this problem well? Could we get the farmers a better price for their perishable goods than they would otherwise? So rather than building a system and deciding to spend the money on a scalable, reliable system, we had this team basically do bubblegum and string, right? So they went out to the markets, they figured out what the prices were for tomatoes. We had 50 farmers who sold tomatoes who were willing to be part of our experiment. And then we had this poor engineer in the back room who would get the phone calls about the tomato prices, and he would SMS text all these 50 farmers, right? Not necessarily the most fun job for him, but boy, was it important to test out whether or not we could get them better prices. And it turns out that we were able to get them, I think, 17% better prices than they were getting otherwise, which is huge, right? That's the difference between a child going to school or someone getting shoes or people even eating that night. So based on that, we decided this was an important place for us to go into, and now it's being made scalable and reliable and
well, the manager is part of the process. Right? The argument is the data coming from the customers.
The data is coming from the customers, and if they hadn't been getting better price, we wouldn't have gone after it.
That's stitched into the culture.
Yep.
And I think effective, successful companies that innovate continually keep it consistent with their culture.
Absolutely.
We were talking earlier. Nike went from shoes to swimming and golf, but they kept a kind of core around aspirational achievement. IBM focuses on business customers very effectively and sort of abstracting their problems. Other companies have had a much bigger challenge around that. I mean, Xerox and Blockbuster, did not conceive of the world the way other people did. And, the Netflix way of conceiving of the world was a more effective way. With that in mind, I got to play a little surprise on you. Because Mark and I were talking before, and I said, I want you to present them with a problem or an innovation, a potential innovation, and have each one of you talk about how you would approach it in the context of what your company culture is. And if you all have the same kind of answer, we're going to fail. So what'd you come up with, Mark?
Well, it's something near and dear to my heart, so maybe it's being a little bit selfish here, but it's been some work that I've been thinking about as it relates to business model innovation. So my question for you is, how would you think about the necessary innovation to go into the emerging markets, but not the way that I think the typical corporation has been doing it, which is to go into the top of the pyramid? How would you really get at the S2? At least the middle of the pyramid, if not somewhat in the bottom of the pyramid.
Can you name a specific market so we really can sort of drill into
that? Such as India.
Okay.
We'd go out there on the streets and we would spend a lot of time with those customers. We would try to understand what their unmet needs were, and we'd try to come up with a lot of ideas for how they might be solved, and we'd try a bunch of things, and most of them wouldn't work.
But would you see it in the context of a tax company, a payments company, a company that looks at what people do with money?
We would focus on how can we improve people's financial lives, and we would look at how they were solving their problems already, and we would go after what was taking a lot of time and creating them pain and try to come up with ways to make it better.
And how would you not be inundated by just way too much data?
I think what you have to do is you go out there and you get the insights for inspiration, right? And then you take those inspirations, and that's when you try to come up with potential solutions, and you make them on Post-its, and you make them on storyboards, and then you iterate those with the customers, and you winnow it down. And then you're wrong, and you do it again.
And what would entail the solution? Would it just be product?
It would be an experience. It would be based on what their problem was. It would be, how can you solve this problem well?
So, Inder, I assume you'd have a similar approach in India. You would go to every person on the street and see if they wanted a core router.
That's what I'm thinking.
That is a good idea. I think what we would do is, I think in order to win in emerging countries, you have to have at least 3 steps. I think the first one is presence. You have to actually physically be there, as opposed to trying to come up with ideas sitting over here. Unless you're present, you really don't have a right to play. I think the second step after that is relevance. You have to build products that actually appeal to those people. I mean, it's, you want to sell something, as Jeff Immelt says, for 15% of the price, but which has 50%, 50, of the functionality. And so in order to do that, you have to make it relevant. I mean, the classic example is the one where, GE was trying to sell its imaging equipment, the one with which you do the ultrasound and so on, and it was too expensive in the US, so they asked their Chinese engineers to actually build it in China. And they came up with a design that was indeed 15% the cost, but it had about half the functionality. For example, it was much smaller, which means you could actually get it in and out of elevators. It was portable, so that 5 hospitals could use the same thing, etc. And once they did that, their sales and their market share rocketed with that. And then they turned around and brought that innovation all the way back to the US, where they're gaining huge market share with it now. So you have to build a product that's really relevant. And then the third step, presence, relevance, the third step, I think, is really, certainly for a company like ours, to cause some degree of transformation. And for us, what that means is, because we're in the networking business, to actually look at this phenomena of cities, smart and connected cities that are actually getting created all around the world, where there's fundamental problems. Education is not accessible. Healthcare is not affordable. How do you do that? How do you get a student 1 month of education on $1? How do you get a person, a doctor's visit for $1 remotely using networks and so on? So that's transformative in nature. And once you've had the presence and you've built the relevance, then you get to the transformation category, and that gives you that right to actually play in that market.
And do you think you're staying inside Mark's structure? Does that change your business model? That is not your U.S. business model?
Yes, and what it does is it's going to fundamentally alter your business model. Within most companies of the kind that we operate in, you need to have an end-to-end business model that's your established country model, and an end-to-end business model, which is your emerging countries business model. Because, when you get 30 million phones being activated a month with mobile subscribers and so on, and average revenue per user is $3, not $75, you got to have a different business model with a different manufacturing, different supply chain, different distribution, different everything. And unless and until you do that, and you're not going to succeed, and many companies will struggle really hard. It's like disruptive innovation, hard to do. We ourselves are struggling with it right now. I'm not going to say we've got that problem solved. We're part the way there in terms of trying to solve it, but that's, I think, what you got to do.
The strange innovation,
end-to-end business model.
The strange innovation in the world right now is companies like Facebook and Twitter and Skype, and which there's two things to note about them to me that is very innovative, and I think a lot of companies are going to have to adapt. One, zero to global in like nothing, right? Groupon's in 40 countries and it's 2 years old. You know, the other thing is there's no number two. Like, who's the other Twitter? Who's the other Skype?
But all of these companies have a offering that is virtual.
Yeah, and it
It's
scales
not
like
physical.
crazy, and
it scales like
a little
crazy.
payment here and a little payment here and a little payment. They can sort of go through the world for nickels, you know, and they pick them all
right.
up. And it turned out there were 8 billion of them, and that really added up pretty well.
Yeah.
You know, so circle back to the India question.
So yeah, we actually
You're in India, though.
we're in India. Emerging market activity for us, you have to think about the core of the business. We're in the tools business. We're in the platform business, if you will, horizontal platforms that others can build on top of using our tools or other tools. And then we're in the applications business as well. But the strength of the platform business is others doing interesting things with our tools and our platforms and commingling them with other platforms, because there's a blend of open source and all kinds of stuff that people run in and around our stuff, which is fine. So what we do in emerging markets is we think about it. We actually have an initiative. You can look it up on using your favorite search engine. You could look it up on the web.
I can dig it.
And you could look up Microsoft Innovation Centers. So the model that we use in this area, which is really a middle, bottom of pyramid style market, really middle of pyramid, bottom of pyramid is really hard to get to, where we go in and carry on a conversation about what the economic impact they would like to see in their local economy. And it can be real fundamental, basic kinds of things. It can be skills training and skills building, et cetera. And so the process by which we bootstrap these centers is based upon local interest and local need, where we do what we do well, and then we get out of the way. So to the points that have been made, we have to be present in the market. So in 80 countries around the world, we're pretty deeply present locally with people on the market. In the market. And then others around the table make up the whole. And so it's targeted towards some 3-year operating plan where they get out of it what they want to see out of it, and it's measurable because we measure everything. Everybody here measures everything. And there are about 100 of these centers in about 50 countries now around the world. We announced it in India some years ago, 6 or so years ago. We've probably opened 150 or 160 of them, but we've closed those that don't maintain or sustain, because there needs to be some sense of quality and sustainability based upon the use of the brand, which is interesting to them and interesting to us. And at the very top of these centers, there are really interesting things being done that are application-like, that in some cases have found their way into really interesting industrial applications with embedded uses of our technology, or in other areas it really is just skills building. If you find a country, let's pick on one like Chile, let's say, where 50% of the money that goes into the educational system goes to about 3% of the population. The rest of the population is taken care of. They've got a good social security system, et cetera, but they need to be trained. And they need to have access to the systems, because there is a public social security system that's been put in place as a result of the good economic impact that copper and salmon fishing and wine and a few things have done for them. So all that's good, but if people don't have access and know how to have the skills to do the kind of interactions that require them to actually be a participant in society distributed across a very broad geography. So each one is a different problem. They're all different. And so we look at it from the local context, and then we do what we're really good at, and then we get out of the way.
Well, I think the interesting thing, all of you are, you did answer it in different ways relative to your company. That's important. But the common theme was innovation that mattered to the customer.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, what's the point if it isn't that? And innovation that's easy to do, interesting thing to choose. Innovation that is important to the customer, that's kind of brand sustaining.
And if you're a big, rich company and
you all are.
And super international in particular, I mean, you guys are in.
We're not.
You're not as, you don't have the scale like this.
Yeah.
Cisco, we're in the same countries. It's like IBM. We're 5 or 6 really big companies that are in all these countries around the world. And so for us, the first thing that comes out of people's mouths in general is big company, whack.com, whack, in our case, Bill Gates, whack, write us a check or buy us dinner. And in fact, that's not our institutional memory, right? Our institutional memory is our business model, and the integration of those things into the local economy. And so So part of it is creating a context and a conversation where everyone can agree that there's value to be had by all if everyone reduces to those common denominators of their best practice and what they need.
I want to take what we just did here with this. Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to make one other quick observation. I think that we talked a lot about emerging countries, and I think it's very much in fashion and in vogue to talk about those because of the high growth rates. But I think in the process, we have to make sure that you don't over-rotate on that and forget the established countries where still there is a ton of money to be made. I mean, all you have to do is look at a company like Nokia, which was very, very focused on the India market because there were 30 million subscribers a month, and they had a little cell phone with a flashlight and with a radio and with a scratch-proof surface and all of that. But in the process, they took their eye off the ball in established market, and then RIM and Apple and everybody ate their lunch in the smartphone market, etc. So you have to make sure that you do both sustaining, both established and emerging countries. And like the GE example of the ultrasound machine, if you can actually succeed in both and use one for the benefit of the other, then you really get a very good multiplier effect.
Okay, well, I'm going to put it to you since you interrupted me. But pegging off what we talked about just then in terms of, change but consistent with who you are and what you do, I want you to, now let's take it out into the audience, then we'll have some Q&A, where I'd like each of you to point to something you think will be disruptive for them, for the audience. And let's not just do cloud, because that's too baggy, a little bit more specific if you could.
Okay.
So what's a great disruption that people will be talking about a year or two from now that they ought to start thinking about?
So I guess we're not allowed to say cloud, mobile, consumer, or apps.
It's in the world already. So, if they write that on a whiteboard tomorrow, it's going to get hated.
Yeah, so I think that there's two or three. I think I'd say design, cities, and analytics. Those would be the three. I know you asked for one. And by design, what I mean is because the whole world is moving to a series of connected services, continuous services and connected devices, as Ray Ozzie calls it, you're going to need very, very cool devices that appeal to users.
That's interesting. And speed of learning is a huge issue.
Is a huge issue, right?
So the toughest thing to hire for in the Valley right now, as far as I can see, is good UI and UE people.
Right, and therefore design, Kaaren. I mean, it's going to be. I think design is going to be super important. I think cities are going to be super important because that's where 80-90% of power consumption happens. That's where the bulk of humanity's hopes are built, et cetera, and so on. And how do you make them intelligent, connected, smart, et cetera? And then I think the power of data. I think that we in the technology industry have been so all consumed with the transportation of data, with the manipulation of data, that we sometimes forget the inherent value embedded in the data in the form that gets unlocked through analytics. That's where companies like IBM, companies like Microsoft, many others are really focused. And I think that, to me, I think those three are big things that people are not talking about as much.
You got to read my story in the next Forbes. What you got? Got kind of data angle going on.
Just personal opinions. I do think that health, and I think personal health.
Personal health.
Yeah, sensors. I mean, in general, I just think it's about sensors, and then it does boil down to, it's big, buckets of information for sure, publicly available and related,
but
whether it's
biogenetic.
But I think the personalized approach in the next 3 to 5 years is going to be the most interesting thing, because I think you could start to, with people opting in to expressing with sensors sort of personal medical information, I think you can start to see insurance and preventive health and all those models starting to morph.
Those chains will tighten.
And I think, just as sort of a personal belief, that there is a treasure trove of real opportunity given the social situation that our society here in the U.S. and I think all societies eventually will face, which are these moral dilemmas over time that come about as a result of healthcare systems. So I think that's the most interesting thing. And then I'd love to see more things going on in education because it's my personal interest. And there are some interesting things going on that I find fascinating, like the Khan Academy and what Salman Khan is doing, things like that. But health is the one that strikes me because there's a huge return at a societal level. That's at our fingertips right now.
Kaaren?
So I think a couple. One is I think the barriers to entry for starting a business are going down surprisingly quickly, right? So when you think about the cost of hosting, the cost of storage, even getting talent, diverse talent, that's really amazing. And we're seeing a lot more different kinds of small businesses as a result. I actually agree with you on the data analytics, although I would say, again, as a psychologist, maybe a little biased here, but I think the most interesting aspect of all of this data are getting the behavioral economists in to come up with theories and to get really interesting insights that your standard data scientists may not be going after.
I agree.
And then finally, I would say that geolocation and really understanding people's context and where they are is providing us with an enormous amount of information. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that next year.
Such as where your teenage daughter is during the party on a Friday night. Yeah.
Well, that timed perfectly. Let's take a few minutes of questions. Do people? Sorry. Oh, Mark. I'm sorry.
It
was 8 o'clock. I'm on a tight schedule.
So I'll say it quickly. I'd just like to add to Daniel on the healthcare side, and I just frame it just a little bit differently, which is I think what you're going to see is the site of care move, from the hospital to the outpatient clinic, to the doctor's office, to the home, in technologies that enable that movement.
Yeah.
Is going to be what's disruptive, which is going to reduce the cost of care and increase convenience. And you could do the same thing from the caregiver side, things that move it from the specialist to the doctor to the nurse practitioner, to the caregiver at home.
The story on your partner we recently did, I'm sure you saw.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
We did a cover on his partner, Clayton Christensen, and very quickly, what did Clayton go through in the course of a couple of years?
So let's see. Well, he's had type 1 diabetes for the last 30 or so years. Then he had a heart attack. Then he had follicular lymphoma, kind of cancer. And then most recently he had a stroke about a year ago.
And he's doing pretty well.
And he's doing pretty well.
And has a whole lot of ideas about medicine.
Absolutely.
You really ought to check out. The guy's got some brilliant thinking there. But let's hear some brilliant thinking from the audience. Questions? Sir.
Sanjay Marimadaya. I do
Yes.
new business incubation at HP. The question I have for the panel here is that what kind of direction do you give in big corporations when you get these people on innovation? You look at Amazon, from a consumer, they're now into enterprise, from cloud computing, and Apple reinventing into the consumer space. But then there are questions now asked about Cisco, whether my business model was flip a right thing, looking at a highly profitable enterprise business getting into consumer. So your sense on what should be the direction, looking at the business model, strategic direction.
Yeah. So I think, one of the fundamental tenets of innovation is that you should be willing to fail and fail early and fail often, because unless you're willing to do that, you're never going to have the risk appetite to do truly great things. And in that vein, of the 140 or so acquisitions that Cisco has done, some are going to be successful and others less so. I think consumer business for us is an interesting one, where we are trying new things and new ideas and so on and so forth. And Flip is in that vein. I mean, it's an interesting acquisition where, since your question was specifically around that, where we've learned a lot, right? Who would have known that in the camcorder business, Cisco would have #1 market share, greater than the other 3 second, third, and fourth player combined, and so on. But the real benefit is not just that market share or the value you get from it, but some of the learnings associated with that as you get into the video business and so on and so forth, right? So I think those are some of the learnings. The one thing I'd say, to your point about how do you do sort of the decision making around innovation, for us, I think we've tried to be very open in terms of our open innovation model. I'd just say that, right? Because we've got 24,000 engineers. Probably 20,000 of them work on sustaining innovation, just building the better, cheaper product every year. And more power to them, because we need a lot of them. But then we've got those who actually want to get the $200,000 check that Martin DePiero was handing out in the internal ventures. But then we don't stop there, because we say we've got to go outside the company as well to keep this innovation engine alive. And for that, we've got this model of spin-ins. We go out, we look at what are the best innovative models out there, and in a very unemotional way, we look at the best ones, and we try to spin those back into the company. Well, we're a data networking company that entered the voice market through a spin-in, we entered the storage market through a spin-in, we entered the computing market through a spin-in. And in all those cases, what we're doing is we're basically working with an entrepreneur to make sure that we reduce their risk, but get their innovation and integrate it in a manner that benefits customers in a truly commercial way. Okay. And then, of course, we do a large number of actual acquisitions. So what we're trying to do is maintain this open innovation type of a model, which balances sustaining and disruptive innovation together, so that we can always try to do the right mix between those aspects.
Next question.
Good evening. I'm David at SAP. I have a question for Inder, an organisational question, going back to your anecdote about the telepresence business. How much of an impact did that little business unit have on the category before it was brought back and regrafted onto the Cisco body, and what did the antibodies do to it at that time?
The Tandberg business was actually very beneficial in two ways. One was in and of itself. It's a large business now. It's multiple hundreds of millions of dollars, and it got enhanced with things like Tandberg, etc. And when it was sort of brought back in, we call that mainstreaming. I think you're referring to it as grafting back on. So we mainstreamed that back on, and it's had a dramatic impact, because when we're talking with our customers, they can actually see that product, they can relate it. I mean, let's face it, CEOs, CXOs, they don't look for inspiration in a wiring closet, right? So we needed to get something that was out there, but then it creates a tremendous amount of drag for our mainstream routers and switches. I mean, I've never sold a telepresence deal where it didn't go with a big network upgrade. So it's dramatically uplifted the conversations, and it's dramatically grown the business. But I will tell you this also, that telepresence would not have gotten to market as quickly if the sustaining engine hadn't created Call Manager, which was already there in most of the Fortune 500, which allowed it to work quickly.
Mm-hmm. Next question.
So I'm curious if you have any perspective on innovation as it relates to how we work. It wasn't 10 years ago where teleworking or telecommuting and open workspaces was innovative and new, and today there's this new trend called crowdsourcing. I'm curious if you have any exposure or opinions as it relates to crowdsourcing and how we work as it relates to innovation.
Well, can I jump in? I'm going to tell my freelancer.com story. Yeah. I talked to the CEO of an outfit called freelancer.com. They now have 2.5 million people worldwide just bidding on jobs they'll do. I'll do this job for this much. People say, I need this. They bid up. And it used to be about designing web pages. But now it's about designing semiconductors, or it's about designing models of engines, all sorts of things. I need a tractor under these conditions. What am I bid? And I got to say, footnote, the bids are really low. And it's leading to all sorts of interesting organizational behavior. The CEO, this applied to me. The CEO said he bid out to have a blog post written. And he got a bid back, write it for $10. Little footnote, I charge more than that, or I need more than that for my running room. But there was this woman, Selena in London, who would do it for $10. He liked his results, bid out again. Woman in the American Midwest said she'd do it for $6 and offered up as her portfolio. And portfolios are very, very important in this world. You show your work, and that's how you get hired. And in her portfolio was the blog post that Selena in London had written. Well, so the CEO, having access to a lot of information, looks into this, and it turns out that Selena in London is two guys in Mumbai who have realized that they can, spoof being a British woman and get a higher price. And their English actually isn't so good. So they then subcontracted to this woman in the Midwest who's getting paid $4. Okay, that's the world. Two guys in India are subcontracting to the Americans for $4. And $6 for her is a 50% raise. That's a model of the world to come in many ways. Quick teams formed for specific discrete tasks. The guy you want to be in that is the person who organizes the team. You want to be the management layer as quickly as possible. Anybody else want to jump in?
Can I give a quick example of crowdsourcing? Also, something that we actually use when we created this emerging technologies group, we wanted to get ideas from people. certainly because we didn't have all the ideas. So we created a prize, $250,000, which is a lot of money, to anyone who could come up with a good idea. And we got 2,500 entries, 1,100 new ideas, 104 different countries. And the prize was not only $250,000, but you also got to then come work for Cisco and start that business as a business unit. And it actually worked so well, we were actually trying to do it again and again every year. I think some other companies also have a similar approach.
Netflix $1 million prize.
Yeah,
we have internal auctions.
Same thing, yeah.
Yeah. Next question.
So I had a question about primarily disruptive innovation. I think one of the things we talked about, and I think we've kind of brushed over a little bit, is who's the customer and who's the market. And so one of the questions I have in particular is when you start thinking about what you're going to do with disruptive innovation, the question is, who are you really targeting and identifying that marketplace? Because a lot of companies that are established will look at analyst reports, but if you're looking at an analyst report, the market's already been factored for you. So how do you go about defining the market and making sure it's an attractive opportunity?
That's a really good question.
So when we think about actually how you go forward, and it always obviously starts with the customer who has an important unsatisfied job they're trying to get done. But the characteristics of that customer is we call them a non-consumer, that they're not consuming at all because they're kept out of an offering or a market because they don't have the wealth, they don't have the skills, they don't have the access. Hence, the whole emerging markets side of things. And so the innovation, the disruptive innovation, is going to enable a larger population of less skilled or less wealthy people to start doing things that they weren't able to do given what the offering is. And of course, the classic example that started the whole disruptive innovation work was in comparing, personal computers to mini computers. People couldn't afford mini computers because they were $500,000 machines in the corporate market. The personal computer came in as a toy and enabled a larger population of people to do things for themselves. So it's the targeting of non-consumers with the mindset of enabling them to do things because they couldn't afford it or they didn't have the skills in the past, and then zeroing in on what are those specific jobs, those consumer insights that you were trying to get done to be able to target them.
Given the urgency and the likely failure rate, I suspect you have to have many, many things going on at once. So the trick becomes having a lot of touch points that are good feedback loops and not expensive to run.
Small-scale experiments.
Yeah, and then just keep feeding that loop as it comes in. That's sort of like the model you're talking about, 4 or 5 people talking to a customer.
Yep.
Yeah.
And experimenting with them.
Okay,
Yeah.
next question.
How do we know when we've innovated too far, where we've incorporated so many smaller companies to create that new model that we're working for? How do we know as bigger companies that we're actually heading into deficit losses because we've invested in innovation that really isn't there? So as big companies that are a little more cumbersome, how do we step back and know or realize we're approaching a threshold in innovation that we can't sustain?
You've diluted out your identity, or you've just taken on too many things that you can't absorb? Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And let's specifically look to Cisco and Microsoft. We do this as a machine. So how do we know we've gone too far? When do you realize you're in too many market adjacencies? When do we realize that Flip, for example, or these other small things that were a little bit further than what we do, how do we realize that we're innovating too hard?
Yeah, I think that on balance, I think that most of the time, our experience certainly is that most of the time, our errors are ones of omission rather than of commission. I think it's something that you mentioned the other day, Kaaren. And I think that most of the time what we found, looking back at our own experience in retrospect, is that we either haven't moved aggressively enough or haven't taken enough risk. So generally speaking, what we found is we've never turned the dial too far. Now, there could be a situation where you're putting so many balls up in the air or taking so many shots at goal that you're getting a little bit scatterbrained around it. I think that there's a little bit of that, frankly, that's happening at Cisco today, that I think we need to address more proactively in terms of bringing our focus a little more narrow. And I think that as we do that, the market's has a good way of telling you that, and I think we're learning from that. And frankly, in my personal opinion, I think we went a little too far in terms of putting too many balls up in the air.
I think at Microsoft it's more, most everything we do, we think very horizontally and very broadly. And so some of the investments don't pay off for a long period of time. Web TV was an acquisition from the mid-90s that was sort of the basis for bringing this campus together, along with a series of other acquisitions, Hotmail and a few others. And Hotmail's been a pretty good bet, still continues to. The TV business has meandered in various ways, but we don't feel too bad about the position with Xbox and Xbox Live. It has more subscribers paying fees than the largest cable operators in the United States. Not a bad business. We don't feel too bad about the video work that's going on with AT&T and in the U.S. market and in 20 or 30 other countries where we're delivering IP-based television through the phone companies, if you will, to grossly generalize. But did that initial acquisition, which was intended more or less in the beginning to be this approach to television, has it manifested itself in the way that was envisioned? No. Is it a bet the company still wants to place and is willing to place because video is really important and big screens are really important? Yes. And so there are things that go on longer and the market context changes, but there's a certain belief system that in these big, broad, horizontal bets, especially when you've got these core businesses, to the comments that have been made, that do very well over time, you've got to, when the law of large numbers starts to appear, and you've got 90,000 employees and 40,000 engineers, and you've got to grow. If double-digit growth means you're growing a 7 or 8 or 9 or $10 billion business every year, and the markets have an expectation of a certain kind of contribution margin return on that, you've got to place those bets. And so at one level, we just look at 8 very large businesses and big bets, and then there's a few small ones that are on the side that we hope turn into big ones, and we'll stick to it. I mean, that's a portfolio management game that the CEO has to play. That's the fundamental decisions they get to make, and sometimes you get rewarded, sometimes you don't. We were chatting earlier about, in terms of the size and scale of our businesses at Cisco and Microsoft over the last 10 years, they have grown incredibly. They have produced incredible profits. Does the market respond the way we'd like it to? Not necessarily, but do we think, if you step back and look at it all from a vantage point of a CEO or an executive staff member inside of a big company, what other bets would you place? You have to do these things. So
the point is to endure.
It's really hard. Yeah, you have to endure. Right?
Sure. Can I just add one, just so that it's not only about the bets you place to be careful of, but it's how much innovation headroom do you have in your core market too?
Yeah.
That there's a risk in trying to always be ahead of the competition.
Right.
That you can over-innovate and overshoot what the customer.
And then you destroy your base.
Then you destroy your base, and the word for that also is commoditization.
Right.
That you see commoditization taking place, but yet innovation is still marching forward because you're trying to beat the competition.
Race to zero is not a fun one. And the points have been made earlier. You do think about that, about whether it's the blogger that's posting for $10, but somebody's really making $4, and there's arbitrage in the middle.
It's interesting how, to your point, Mark, sort of Apple actually does this quite well, right? Because you look at the iPad 2 and you say, why doesn't it have this, and this?
So they can have
because they're saving it for iPad 3.
Right.
Right? That's right. And they do it very well. It's very deliberate.
And it's going to be shiny. Next question.
Hi, Uday Gajendar. I'm Principal Product Designer at Citrix. One key concern that I have, by the way, great panel, wonderful array of topics when it comes to innovation from a business model perspective, technology perspective. But I'm actually really concerned about the design perspective and what it means to incorporate design thinking when it comes to innovation at a large scale strategically, but also tactically when you're trying to experiment and prototype and so forth. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah.
Kaaren?
Yeah, I'd say we actually rely heavily on design thinking. I actually had lunch with Catherine the other day, Catherine Courage over at Citrix. But yeah, we've brought it in. It's absolutely core to how we innovate. I think as a company, we started by focusing on the customer. And from design thinking, we've also brought in the last 4 years, a heavy emphasis on going very broad in our thinking before going very narrow and experimenting even more rapidly than before with our customers. We have a number of mechanisms or levers that allow us to do this. One of them is we've integrated into our leadership training and development programs. So we're going after the mushy middle of management, if you will. We have innovation catalysts. Their managers promise me 2 days a month their time on an annual basis. We give them significant training, and their job is to get other people to use design thinking on their projects. Some of our most successful offerings, our most successful innovations of late, have had at least one, if not 2 or 3 innovation catalysts associated with them. For example, that SnapText offering that I told you about, that had 3 innovation catalysts out of the team of 5. The product that came out of India, the Mobile Bazaar product, that actually was led by an innovation catalyst as well. And then at the very top, of course, we have Brad, who's our CEO, and Scott, our founder, who are very much strong advocates of this. And we actually spend a significant amount of time at Brad's CEO offsites, at our officers' offsites, actually using design thinking with them to help them solve any problem that they've got, which is how we keep our top leadership aligned as well.
I think more and more, the terminal, whatever the end-use device is going to be in a potential state because so much of the software is upstream in a data center. You know, that iPhone, is that a book? Is it a phone? Is it a GPS? Is it a chess game? That, you know, tablet, whatever, you know. The question is, what do I need in the moment? What's the experience I have to offer? So the accessibility of design becomes even more important in that case.
One other observation I just want to make about sort of design is, you know, most of us coming from Silicon Valley think of design and innovation as sort of product design and so on, and we think that innovation is largely technology-centric. But I want to go back to an example I think you used earlier, Mark, about Procter & Gamble and the Swiffer. That was a disruptive innovation for them. But one of the biggest innovations, maybe a design innovation, how I would characterize it, by Procter & Gamble in the area of laundry detergent was laundry detergent compaction. That's a fancy word for saying, can you pack twice as much powder into a liquid format? And you might say, gosh, you know, that doesn't sound very innovative. But when you really think about it, consumers love it because it's easy to carry, easy to pour, easy to use. The retailers love it because it takes a lot less shelf space, so you can sell twice as much per unit. The transportation costs are half. The environmentalists love it because it's less impactful for the environment. So that's a design innovation which normally as engineers, you know, we may not have thought about, but which has huge impact all the way down the chain in terms of a new kind of almost sustaining innovation from Procter & Gamble.
Absolutely.
Next question.
Yeah, you guys talked a lot about the failure rates of innovation. So the question is, when there's a failure, how do you separate the horse, the rider, and the trail? How much is the management of the team versus the market?
How do you avoid being the goat?
Well, no, how do you learn? I mean, what's the market?
How do you reward the learning from failure? How can failure become, as a video game guy said to me, I love being in this business because in video games, losing is part of the point. You know, it's part of the fun in a video game is you lose and you try it again. And I wish I could just stitch that into more of my life, you know. So how do you make losing fun?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is if we were talking about really coming up with a whole new business approach, the only thing you know about that approach is it's going to be wrong. So it's guaranteed to be about failure in the sense that whatever you're going to ultimately do, you're going to be iterating off of. So it's not so much about failure, it's about not learning from that failure and making the course adjustment that's necessary. And so how do you get the right environment to allow for, you know, the mid-course correction, or perhaps even more difficult for companies is to kill these innovations early.
Part of the problem with failure is correctly judging the data. You know, was the product wrong, or are we in the wrong communication with the customer, or are we sensing the data? Like, wins are easier to see the success.
So to that point, you know, back to Procter & Gamble, A.G. Lafley would call it transactional learning. So that to really be able to have the data, to know what went wrong and to be able to discern it, you have to have it in market, and you have to test, and you have to go in a foothold in a pilot where there's a transaction to make it happen. And then I think as it relates to then who takes the blame, I don't think it's framed that way anymore. It's about what did we learn from this situation? Did we have the data understood so that we can decide and make a good decision whether to kill this project whether to step on the gas or whether to make a major course correction.
And I think part of making sure that you do celebrate failure is your culture and talking about the failures, right? And talking about the failures from the top level on down, so it becomes just a part of how you do your work.
All right. I think we can take 2 more questions. One.
All right, so I think I got both of them. So,
all right. You're innovating in the role of question asker.
Absolutely. See, I learned from you.
There you go.
So I have 2 questions. The first question is really around, again, disruptive innovation. We talked about it a little bit, but my question is, how do you encourage disruptive innovation in a company? The reason why I'm asking this is, you mentioned earlier that it's about reducing cost sometimes, and Kaaren, you mentioned sometimes it's about listening to the customer and solving a pain point. But if you look at Connect or Apple, the iPhone, it wasn't about reducing cost, and it wasn't about solving a pain point. It was really about creating a new market. So, doing something completely different. So my first question is, how do you encourage that? My second question is, not Forbes, but there were other magazines like Business Week and Time that mentioned that the cause of recession was actually lack of innovation. That we are actually feeding off of the innovations made in the 80s, and because there's lack of innovation, it, of course, was the cause of recession besides the subprime mortgage. So I would like to know your comments.
If you think there's been a lack of innovation, send me an IM about it.
So I think there are different models for innovation, and I think every company needs to do what works for them. So when I think about Apple, I mean, there's no question that Steve Jobs is an incredibly smart man who is very visionary, and he has had a remarkable number of hit rates. There aren't many companies like Apple in that regard. So rather than looking for a single visionary and relying on a single visionary, Intuit has gone the route of, we're going to really understand our customers well, and we're going to make it so that every employee is out there getting to know the customer and innovating for them. But that's how we've chosen to do it. There are absolutely other models out there, and there are other models out there that work really well. Right?
Yeah, the thing I'd add to that is that often people think that innovation is all about the people. And I think innovation is also about the environment that you create, the culture. We talked a lot about fail early, fail often, just don't fail twice for the same reason. I think that creating that culture, creating a set of incentives, creating structures where things can happen in a certain incubated type of environment. The environment is almost as important as the people are. So I think not ignoring that would be one of the key ideas I'd offer.
And constraint. The other thing I would add to these 2 is just having a constraint model, and depending upon how you look at your business, to the Apple story. Say it again? Yeah, sure. Connect is a success, and it's the fastest Guinness Book of World Record, right? Fastest selling consumer electronics product in history. So it is the most successful consumer electronics product right now. 10 million units, 60 days, whatever the numbers were, is astounding. But the point I was going to make is just the evolution of things over time when they failed, and then when you put constraint on them. So Connect clearly has its first instance, which is in the market, which is constrained. I happen to have seen things that are coming that are less constrained, and so there's much more that can be done with that technology. So you will see an immense evolution of that technology across the board.
Spooky, say more.
So that's very cool. But it starts from a baseline of constraint to get things done at a moment in time with a core capability that was tested with consumers, that delighted and magical, whatever you want to call it, right? All that good stuff. But the example of what systems, processes, and values and cultural attributes, you could say, there were huge constraints that Apple faced when they went through their transition, a near-death experience, an investment from Microsoft to keep them going. Seriously, that all happened. You can read the books, right? And so with that in mind, then you constrain what you build. So I think constraint is really important in the process, and it's a hard thing to do well, and to make those trade-offs, because there's always ways, especially today, more information than you can ever assimilate.
Things tend to compress in the rearview mirror a little bit. And when Jobs showed up, basically he didn't have anything in the drawer.
Right.
So he did something very innovative in a way. He just repackaged things and put it in a single computer with a nice little egg shape, called it the iMac.
Well, they killed all the product lines.
Came out in 6 colors.
Right. The basic.
What a visionary!
The basic. There's a story. I mean, for those who I worked there, right? So the basic story is, it's the Ray Kroc story. Who knows Ray Kroc? Right. Okay. So everybody heard the story about Ray Kroc? You want to hear the story? Because it's an important one, and it's a principle. McDonald's was pretty successful, right? And they were being threatened by all these other fast food entities. Wendy's was on the march, And so the story goes, and I wasn't there, but the story goes, at the sales meeting where they have all the franchisees and all the store-owned operators as well. So there's company employees and then the franchisees. Everybody's in the room, and Ray Kroc is on his deathbed, and he's an old guy, and he's got a cane, and he walks up to the podium, and everybody's on their feet because it's Ray Kroc, and he's the guy, and he says, our goal this year is to crush Wendy's. And everybody went nuts, and he turned around and walked away from the stage. And then he stopped, and he went back to the microphone, and he said, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to get rid of our bad products. So they put constraint in the system, and they went back to the core. Why does In-N-Out do well relative to McDonald's? Because they sell vanilla, strawberry, chocolate milkshakes, burgers, fries. So constraint is a key discipline, and depending upon your business model, it's and then others serve large masters. If you're IBM, and I'm not here to trash IBM because that is a great company that for 100 years has always been on top. Always been on top. Their businesses have changed, but they've always been on top. How do they do that? Whatever the customer wants, they handle it, and they're really good at it.
Just to circle back to my story, because I'm that kind of guy.
Yeah.
He constrained the company around those couple of products, but he also reinvigorated or reminded. He bought himself some time and reminded people of the brand. Right. This is going to be about design and delight, and it was a message internally and externally that bought him enough running room to then come out with the iPod, which also needed quite a bit of time to catch on.
They cut the company in half. They shrunk it to make it profitable because they were hemorrhaging, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
one of the interesting, I was just talking a few days ago to someone who was at Apple at that point in time, and he said that the company literally had between $200 and $300 million left before they would have actually gone bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And he took that entire money and invested it in the branding campaign for the color iMacs. Single focus, bam, right?
And willing to take a risk.
And willing to take a risk. And it worked.
Okay. And you had the last 2 questions. Do we wrap? One more question? Going to award one last question.
Yeah, you got the mic.
Just shout, I'll repeat it.
All right. No, so
they want to capture it.
Okay, we'll get it on the microphone.
Thank you for this last question.
Sure.
So, innovation is one thing, but what comes to mind is in Silicon Valley lore was Xerox that totally missed the opportunity that they had with the graphical user interface. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about the companies your respective companies and your ability to not miss those kind of innovative opportunities?
Well, I just, not as a company, but just tying this back to Steve Jobs, that I think is important from my view, is what Jobs did is he was relentless back to the focus on the customer, the user experience, and then not only about understanding that and developing the product, but integrating the whole organization behind to make that happen. Because the iPod iTunes was a complete business model innovation to be able to make that happen. And so I think if you really want to talk about not missing the opportunity, it's not only about deeply understanding the customer job to be done, but being able to integrate, develop the right business system behind a technology, behind a value proposition that's appropriate to seize the opportunity. And that's where I think organizations will need to become even more and more flexible to be able to turn a profit a different way, to have an operating model and not let the incumbent organization get in the way to do it.
Very quickly.
I would just say it's basically two things: making sure you're very, very, very customer-centric, and making sure that you have the entire end-to-end business model, to your point, that can actually deliver on that customer promise. If you have those 2 things going for you, you're not likely to have the Xerox PARC problem.
Okay. It falls on me to wrap up. You guys have done a fantastic job. I'd like to innovate a little bit at this moment. And instead of my, gassing on about how good you are, I'd like you to offer everyone, quickly as you can, just one thing they could write down tonight. Not 5 or 6 things to think about. One thing they can write down tonight or think about tomorrow morning where innovation is concerned. Kaaren, I know you want to jump at this one. So what is the one? Because I said 3, and she said they only remember 1.
It's true, although I'm going to kind of cheat and put an and. Or I'm going to use some language here.
You and she are in cahoots.
Small teams with the customer. Small teams experimenting with the team.
Small customer-focused teams.
Yes.
Okay. Small customer-focused teams.
And behind that, understand your business model and understand how it works, its ability to do certain things and its inability to do other things. And if you understand the fundamentals of a business model, you'll be able to innovate appropriately so that you can address this user experience.
Can I tweak that to be able to explain your business model to yourself?
Yes. Know thyself first.
Yeah, okay.
You're a good editor.
Yeah.
I'd say get a multiplier effect between doing sustaining and disruptive innovation both, and make sure it's not just restricted to the technology side, but also the business model side.
Okay.
I'll just go with the Gretzky thing. You just have to be thinking about where the puck's going to be.
How do you do that, though?
Well, you have to have a sense of where you are to begin with, and that's knowing yourself. I think that's the cornerstone of it all, and that gets down to your market position and who your customer is, whether it's an enterprise, who you're really selling to, why are they really buying from you. You'll only learn from the people who buy from you. You won't learn from a loss report. So really knowing those who are invested in your success with you, and so I do think it boils down to knowing where you are and where your value prop is. And there's a bunch of really good pieces of work from yours and others that have been written over time about that. Regis.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I'm going to boil it down. I crowdsourced my summation. Small customer-focused teams, be able to explain your business model to yourself, sustain innovation that feeds disruptive innovation, and seek new information. Go out and touch the world. That's 4. If you can keep those in mind, write down the one you like. We have been of service to you, and that is my delight. Thank you very much.
On behalf of our audience and all of us at the Churchill Club, would like to thank our speakers for your candor and for sharing your perspectives so freely with us this evening. As a gesture of thanks, we have for each of you what is destined to become one of the most stylish objects in your closet. Please feel free to model it for the audience. Hold it up. A freshly designed Churchill Club t-shirt. We hope you'll wear it with pride.
Awesome.
Thanks again to our sponsors, Microsoft, Cisco, Innosight, and Accept. We could not have done this without you. You've been a great audience. Thanks again to all of you for coming, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Thank you.